Welcome to Nadir Audio. Today we're going to be doing some tube rolling on my Reisong A10 integrated tube amplifier. So let's get started. So a quick review on the A10. I originally reviewed this back in 2020, a few months after I purchased it. And I really loved the amp and was planning to do some tube rolling back then. But at the time I had it paired with some KEF LS50s, and while there was some synergy in that match, it wasn't perfect, and there was just certain genres of music that didn't quite work. So I wanted to find a better matching pair of speakers before I moved on to the tube rolling. And so a little later that year in 2020, I did try it out with some older Klipsch RB51s I had. And while they certainly would get louder because they were more sensitive speakers, they just weren't quite refined enough for what I wanted. So I tried out a few other speakers, and then late last year in 2023, I picked up the Klipsch RP600M Mark IIs, and I reviewed those earlier this year in 2024, and that's a really good fit. So I finally had some great matching speakers, and then decided to move on with the tube rolling and picked up some tubes, and that's where we're at now. So a quick review on the tubes on this amplifier. This is an integrated amplifier, so we've got two EL34 power tubes, and then we also have a couple of preamp tubes. And then this also has a tube rectifier as well. So we're not going to be playing around with the rectifier today, but we are going to try out a few different power tubes. And because this is a self-biasing amp, as long as we get matched tubes and they're EL34 based, we can try out different manufacturers and it's not a problem. And then for the preamp tubes, we are going to be trying out just one in this video. This particular amplifier, the A10, uses 6N6 preamp tubes, which there's not a lot of variations and a lot of different versions out there. There is an A12 version of this amplifier, which uses 12 AX7s, which are more common. And you can use those with this amp as well. You need to use an adapter, but that's a little more work than I want to do. But we do have one other set of preamp tubes that we'll try out today. Okay, so here's our collection of tubes. So these Mullard EL34s, matched pair, actually I picked up back in 2020, and I think I got those at Music Direct. So back then there were a lot of online retailers where you could pick up vacuum tubes. That's changed a little bit over the years. So as of the making of this video in 2024, there are three main suppliers. So we have the Tube Store, which is in Canada, and then we have the Tube Depot and also Upscale Audio, which are here in the States. So for these remaining sets, I picked these all up at the Tube Store, and that's just because they had the particular tubes I wanted all in stock. So we've got a set of Tung-Sol EL34Bs, and then we have these slightly less expensive Russian Electro-Harmonix EL34s. And so we've got three sets of power tubes total, and they're all matched. And then on the preamp side, we just have this set here. So this is one of the very few of the, let's see, these are 6N2Ps, and these were fairly highly rated on the site at least. These are Voskhod, and some people were using these in a particular deckware amp, and they said that they worked really well, so I thought we could try them out here, and they are compatible with the A10. So that's the only set of preamp tubes we'll be using. But for the others, let's talk a little bit about the setup of the system in general, and then we'll get right to the tubes. So we're using our A10 to do the tube rolling, and then for all the digital sources we're using our Chord Mojo 2 DAC, and for the vinyl we're using our Orbit from U-Turn with a Ortophon 2M red cartridge, and then a Project Phonobox DC phono preamplifier. And then of course we're using our Klipsch RP600M2s as the speakers. So the only other thing I want to mention before we go on to some specific recordings is that it is difficult to do A-B comparisons with tubes, and that's one of the reasons that this video has taken a very long time. So I don't have two versions of this amplifier, so I have to do some listening with specific recordings, take notes, turn off the amp, let it cool down, put the new tubes in, let the new tubes warm up, and then try again. So I can't do direct, immediate A-B comparisons, but I can do them all within a series of days and get pretty accurate results in terms of my own personal preferences and the listening differences. So I did want to just mention that it's a little different than what we normally do. But yeah, let's talk about some specific recordings and how different tubes worked better or worse according to my listening taste. So let's start out with the Mullard tubes. So as soon as I put those in the A10, I did notice a pretty big difference with certain recordings. And it has to do with the muscularity of sound and sort of the density of sound in certain recordings. And one of the recordings that really brought this to the fore was the album Gyrate by Pylon. So I've actually had this on vinyl since the late 80s when I was in college. But I recently picked up this 2020 remaster on CD. And it's a really great sounding recording, and that's one of the things I always really liked about it. It is a very muscular sounding recording, and it also has good jump factor, and so you really get your toes tapping. You want to move when you listen to this. I think that's sort of the point of how they recorded it. And so it was cool to hear a pretty big difference. I had been listening to this with the default tubes, and then hearing that big difference made it much more enjoyable when I moved over to the Mullards. Now there were also a few smaller changes. So one of the things is that I think we get a little bit more resolving power with the Mullards in the high end, which is nice. And on this particular recording, there's a little bit of a shimmer effect or something like that on the guitar, and you really can hear it more on this particular recording with the Mullards than with the default tubes. I would say also that the imaging is a little bit more precise with the Mullards. That wasn't so much a big deal on this particular recording, although you could hear it, but it comes into play more on other recordings. But yeah, I think I was surprised to switch the tubes and hear such a profound difference. And that was pretty cool. And this is one of the recordings where I think it really played out that way. So I also listened to John Coltrane's Live at the Village Vanguard on the Impulse label. And this is one of my favorite Coltrane CDs, and I actually mentioned it in the very first video I made on the A10 amplifier. And it sounded great back then, even when I was using it with the LS50s. And it still sounds great now with the default tubes. We get that sort of light and airiness. We get that sort of holographic tube sound, that 3D sound that works so well, and that little bit of tube sweetness. But with the Mullards, we also get a little bit more density. The instruments are just a little bit more full-bodied, so we're still getting that richness of the mid-range with the horns, but just a little bit more full-bodied, and that's especially noticeable on the drums. So on the first track on this CD, Spiritual, there are some transitions that are really enhanced by some drum fills, there's some flams, there's some drum hits, some cymbal hits, and they're just more impactful when listening with the Mullard. So actually listening to this with these tubes with the RP600M speakers, it's the best I've ever heard this CD. So another recording where I noticed a big difference with the Mullard tubes was on this Deutsche Grammophon copy of Vladimir Horwitz, the studio recordings from New York in 1985, and he's playing a collection of pieces from different composers, including Liszt, Schubert, Schumann, and a few others. And just the piano sound on this is actually one of the early digital recordings from the mid-80s, but it actually sounds surprisingly good, and it really does sound kind of like a real piano. You're getting a lot of those overtones, and I think that density of sound has a lot to do with it, sounding a little bit more real than it did with the default tubes. And so I really like that. This is another one where the Mullard tubes really shined. So for the most part, I really like the Mullards better than the default tubes, which a bit of a surprise because I think that this amplifier was voiced with the original tubes, and it sounds really good with the original Chinese tubes, but I was just surprised at what a difference it could make just in the first set that I tried out. Now there was, I'd say in general, I think it sounds better pretty much across the board, but one place where it was not quite as good was when I was playing certain recordings through my Orbit turntable with the Ortophon 2M Red cartridge and the Project Phonobox DC phono preamplifier. So I think that this amplifier tends to be tilted up a little bit on the treble, and I don't think that the Mullard tubes make it any brighter than it is normally, but there is just a little bit more resolving in the high end. And so I think that the phono setup I have also pushes a little bit on that high end, and then in certain recordings it can make it sound a little bit bright. So this is an example of that. McCoy-Tyner expansions. This is on the Tone Poet series from Blue Note. And in general I really like this recording, but I was finding that there are very pronounced cymbals on the drums on this one. Let's see, the drummer on this is Freddie Waits. And they have great clarity, but it's just a little bit too high in the mix. Not enough to cause listener fatigue. I was able to listen to this whole album and I did enjoy it, but I did notice that, and I would have preferred, if I had an equalizer in the system, I probably would have turned down the treble just a little bit. So I think that doesn't so much have to do with the Mullard tubes, it just has to do with this particular phono setup. And I think pairing it with the A10 with the Mullards is maybe not a perfect fit for certain recordings. But we'll be trying it with some of the other tubes, so I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. So next up we have the Tung-Sol tubes, and these were even more of a surprise than the Mullards. So while these dial back the density just a touch from the Mullards, what we get in exchange is even more resolving, not just in the high end, but also in the mid-range and even in the bass. So in the Coltrane live recording, for example, we lose just a little bit of that impactfulness in the drum transitions, but we gain a lot in just hearing textures in the instruments that we hadn't heard before. The bass line, there's a lot of detail there that I wasn't getting before, and that was kind of amazing to hear. It drew my attention to something that I hadn't really been noticing. So I say in general, these are, I guess you would consider them to be a little bit more analytical. That's kind of an unusual thing to say for a tube amp. But you really are getting a lot of those little micro details. So what I found myself drawn to with these tubes was listening to some of my best recordings, including audiophile recordings live to 2 tracks, also just really good recordings in general. So one of the ones that I listened to was Transcending Continents and Memories. This is one of my few truly audiophile recordings, so we've heard about this one before on this channel, but it just sounded amazing. The amount of lifelike natural detail was really pretty cool. But I really enjoyed some other recordings too. There's the Peter Herford's Romantic Organ Music. This is another really great digital recording from the 80s, and I was hearing lots in this one that I hadn't noticed before. And even in Wendy Carlos's Switched on Bach, this is a really amazing recording, and there's just a lot there that I was getting in this setup that I hadn't got before. So I'd say the drawback is just that these tubes with this amp are less forgiving of less than perfect recordings. So some of the things that got a pass, even with the Mullards that I could listen to enjoyably, it's really kind of drawing the flaws of the recordings to my attention in a way that makes me not want to listen to those as much. And in fact, my entire vinyl playing system, I think, is showing some of its limitations. I didn't tend to like much of the vinyl I was listening to with these tubes because I was just hearing some things I hadn't heard before. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That might make me want to upgrade my vinyl playback solution and try some other things, and this might be a great setup to try that out with. So I'd say that between the Tung-Sols and the Mullards, I'd say the Mullards are a little bit better all-purpose. I think they're a little bit more flexible in the amount of things you'll be able to listen to and enjoy. Whereas I think that if most of your listening collection is really great recordings, audiophile level recordings, then you might prefer the Tung-Sols. So the last power tubes I tried out were the Electro-Harmonix, and these are the closest to the tubes that came with the amplifier, so we don't get any of that extra density. I think they may be just slightly more resolving in the high end than the default tubes, but again, it's that sort of slightly grainy, very pleasant high end that the original tubes have, so it's kind of a similar sound. And again, this amplifier sounds great with all tubes, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think if you're looking for inexpensive replacement tubes and you're having trouble getting the Chinese tubes for some reason, I think that these would be a really good substitute. And the other nice thing about these and the default tubes is that they're very forgiving of less than perfect recordings, and they sound really good with really good recordings, so that's kind of nice. They're very flexible, you can use them with all different kinds of things, and they sound really good. So I did try out the preamp tubes, and they do make a difference, but what they do exactly is different depending on which power tubes you try out. So I started trying out the different combinations, and I think that this video is just getting a little bit long. I think the best thing we'll do is we will create a follow-up in the coming months where we look at preamp and power tube combinations that work particularly well. And we'll revisit these and maybe some other preamp tubes that I can find on the market. But I think for now, it was really fun doing this tube rolling, and I found, with the Mullards and also with the Tung-Sols, I found some tubes that do very different things that I think can be really cool in different applications, and I may be using the Mullards as sort of my regular go-tos for a while. I really like what they bring to the table, but they also are pretty flexible and you don't have to just listen to audiophile recordings, which I think is good. But I think that's it for this video, guys. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.